Green light's on. It's on. No? Do I need to? Well, it has a green light. Hold on. Now we got more. Instead of visuals, we got audio. So. I didn't turn it on, right?
Yeah. Now, if you
Is that mute button?
yeah, but it's not me. So, you want to do Shane's mic until I get Steve up here? Okay, hold on.
Never done that.
Well, we're gonna try it, but don't move around.
Don't move.
Don't move around, like back and forth and back and
Oh,
forth.
I don't. Do that anyway.
Okay, wait a minute. So now, you have to clip this on somewhere,
Somewhere.
and then you're gonna put this on your ear. So,
Help me
over.
out. I don't know how to do this.
Yep. Oh, I think you're supposed to have one of these things on it.
For health and safety.
Sure. And then I will text Steve and tell him the mic isn't working. But if it, hold on. Yeah, it's muted.
I don't hear anything.
Wait a minute. Let me see something.
Okay. I'm trying. Uh-oh. No.
Cody, mic. Don't turn it off. Wait.
It's on.
Okay, now.
Hmm. Is that here? No. How about if I take this off? Take my podium off back. Whatever you can do from your end. And John won, and so on and so forth. So it was really fascinating. And for a guy that glazes over at poetry, we had a guy speaking that, oh my gosh, it's like I understood what he's saying. And it was in the explanation, and it's like, wow. And so hopefully you get a good person explaining those things, and it helps us all. So probably more on that later. So anyhow, okay, as we continue on, we're in a time period where all these things are changing, as we've said, and that becoming more and more of kind of what the culture is around us. And so when we ended last time, we were talking about how things have moved from the print media influence, the Gospel Advocate and Firm Foundation and whatever the various publications were, to now there's the Herald of Truth. And the Herald of Truth was where radio broadcasting on a national scale took place within our fellowship, and then also went to even TV format. And so the influence of that, and so Baxter Barrett Baxter, a name we've probably heard if we were familiar with that, and he was one of the main speakers. And so what was happening during this time is there is a change from kind of the traditional message, if you will, to one that's dealing with broader topics, because it's reaching a broader audience. And so we see this change in what was being preached and talked about. And so by the 70s, these sorts of themes, these things of, how do you deal with the modern world, anxiety, the home, so on and so forth, these themes became pretty standard in what was being preached. And so these themes increasingly dominated the Herald of Truth programming, and the sectarian themes, so much a part of the identity of Churches of Christ for a century and a half, receded far from the background. And so if the Herald of Truth strategists during the 50s had simply sought to communicate the traditional messages of Churches of Christ, Herald of Truth strategists of the 70s engaged in a market analysis to determine the kinds of messages that would most likely capture the attention of a secular or broader listening audience than just those in the Churches of Christ. And so this was a change, and maybe those that listened to that broadcast and stuff maybe perceived those things. And so it's part of that was, how do you communicate and reach out to an audience that is different from your own? How do you broaden that message and appeal? Well, some thought very poorly of that, and others embraced that. Aside from the consistent presentation of the plan of salvation, the Herald of Truth routinely conformed its preaching to the therapeutic gospel, as some have called it, that prevailed among conservative religionists, and there was those in Christianity of the more conservative bent. These were the topics that they were talking about too. And this shift held significance not just for the Herald of Truth, but for our fellowship as large. So things were changing. Early in this class, we noted that the editors had served throughout our history as a functional equivalent of bishops. In other words, remember, we've always said, in the way we're organized, our polity, as it's called, you got the autonomous, independent congregations and the elders and so on and so forth, and that was a closely guarded and protected understanding, and still is even today. And so, and for some, that organizational way of doing things is held up as almost the equivalent of the gospel. And if you do different than that, you're going away from the gospel. Well, some might question that, but anyhow, and so we said that even though we had this independent and there wasn't some overarching organizational top-down, that those editors, those publications, Gospel Advocate, Firm Foundation, held a whole lot of influence, and in a sense served or had the power of, that even though there wasn't the structure there. Well, people in the pew voted for these bishops by their subscriptions. In other words, how many people subscribe to the Gospel Advocate, the Firm Foundation, so on and so forth. And if they started doing stuff they didn't like, I'm canceling my subscription. Okay, and we're not unfamiliar with that, that idea. And so in an age dominated by electronic media, this traditional print media among our churches of Christ became less and less important. Now, we see that totally in a little different form today. What do we see happen in the newspapers? They're shutting down. They're closed. And so why is that? Because you got digital. And so in a sense, a little bit different components, but the same kind of idea that this change happens, and so this is happening here. Speakers on the Herald of Truth increasingly displaced the editors of the gospel papers as bishops within this tradition. These newer bishops drew their support from people, not from individual subscriptions, but collectively from congregations which could choose to support or not support the Herald of Truth. Now, was anybody ever in a congregation that supported them? Or you're not sure? Now, how did that happen? Well, a congregation would send their money to the congregation that was overseeing it. As we've mentioned in missions and so on, that cooperating church concept is how that was accomplished. And so, again, these things change. Yet these newer bishops were a breed apart from their predecessors. The print media bishops historically had defined orthodoxy on a variety of issues, but only those issues that the church at large had deemed worthy of discussing. Further, the print media bishops were the intramural bishops, meaning they spoke only to the confines of the Church of Christ. And so what is this saying here? First of all, the influence of our papers were among our people. Okay? And so that's what he's talking about as intramural, as opposed to when it got into the much wider spectrum, because they were broadcast. And so who determined what was the issues? Well, sometimes it was these editors and what they thought was important. I can't remember, you've maybe heard something along these lines, but, who is it that determines what the news is? What are the important topics worth discussion? I remember reading something else from the New York Times, or maybe it was somebody, on the broadcast TV that says the news is what we say the news is. Or whoever, but the news is whatever we say it is. And so, in a sense, that kind of idea. Now, the electronic bishops, if you will, spoke to a national audience well beyond the boundaries of our fellowship, so a much greater reach. That alone gave them symbolic power that far transcended the power wielded by any print media bishop. Consequently, the electronic bishops did not so much speak on issues already established as they symbolically defined, but virtue of the issues they chose to address, and those who chose to ignore, which issues are worth discussion, and which were essentially because this person thinks it's important, that doesn't mean you think it's important. But because they had the much broader audience, they have that influence. And so as the electronic bishops increasingly focused on issues pertaining to self-esteem, anxiety, marriage, family, and the like, pulpit preachers throughout our fellowship quickly followed suit. As those became those topics. And remember, we saw, when we were talking 2 weeks ago, we saw the different books, how in the 50s, that there was this desire, and then, like Norman Vincent Peale, The Power of Positive Thinking, which probably maybe most of us have heard of that. And there was another book that was kind of more from the Catholic tradition and some from the Jewish tradition. In other words, there was this focusing on these topics that was going on across the cultural, religious spectrum, if you will. And so by the late 70s, especially in large congregations in urban centers, one could listen to preachers at Churches of Christ for weeks or months on end and never hear anything remotely approaching the traditional message that had defined our tradition for 150 years. In other words, it wasn't how come you're not, or how come you're using instruments, or supporting this or that, or those topics that had often so dominated, and maybe many of us heard consistently growing up, that wasn't the focus of the things, but rather these broader issues that affected people. So, there we go. So this is the proper context for us to assess this impact of Batzel Barrett Baxter had on Churches of Christ. For Baxter was the first and by far the most powerful of these electronic bishops. And significantly, Baxter's roots were in the Stone Lipscomb tradition of things, as we've talked about, that apocalyptic rooting. His father, Batzel Baxter, so that's why his son has 3 names. He's not a junior, but he has, right? Graduated from the old Nashville Bible School in 1911. So he had Lipscomb as a teacher, and he probably had Harding and some of the others. And so we've gone over that extensively. He later served as a dean of Cordell Christian College. That was one of the college. Was that the one in Kansas or the one in Arkansas? That was before Harding. You would think I would know. I can't remember. But we had talked about those things. Under J.N. Armstrong, and as a member of the faculty at Harding. He served as the president of Abilene from 1924 to 1932, Pepperdine from 37 to 39, and Lipscomb from 32 to 34 and 43 to 46. And so his dad had a lot of deep roots in these institutions. While his son, Batzel Barrett Baxter, had no sense of the 19th century apocalyptic perspective. And so remember, we said that, and we've gone over that in detail, that this world is not my home, that, God's going to destroy all these things, so don't have anything to do with them, and so on and so forth. We've documented how that more dominant thinking changed in the 20th century with World War I and World War II, and it didn't 100% go away, but it was basically nullified. And so people didn't look at it that way. So Baxter's son, Batzel Barrett, didn't look at things the way his dad did. Gee, have any of us ever experienced that with our parents or our kids with us, right? And so it continues. He did inherit from that tradition a gracious outlook and demeanor, and his generous spirit enabled him to redefine in subtle ways through his radio and television preaching on the Herald of Truth the theological task of Churches of Christ. And so again, in modern terms, he's a real influencer. Okay, if we're familiar with that. The Facebook, the TikTok, they're influencers. What have they done to accomplish anything? Some of them, nothing. But they're an influencer, whether they have those credentials or not. But he was an influencer. The symbolic power of the electronic bishops went largely unrecognized by all those involved, including the bishops themselves, the elders of the Highland Church of Christ, and that's in Abilene, by the multitude of congregations that supported the Herald of Truth, and even the anti-institutional wing. In other words, they weren't aware of it. They're very influential, but they did, and you know what? That's kind of a truism that rarely in the midst of things do we recognize really fully what's going on, or comprehending. And it's usually later in looking back that we kind of realize these things. Some churches of Christ have historically denied the existence of any power that transcended the local congregation. No one was prepared to appreciate the enormous power associated with national television programming. And so, why would they say this? This is very influential. Why? People are hearing it. But no, we got autonomous congregations. We do what we want. We give our money to a supporting congregation. So these things that we've kind of told ourselves influence that, but in reality, there's a whole lot of things going on. So just as an awareness. Nonetheless, electronic bishops effectively and very quickly define themselves out of existence. For some, or for the more, they focused on issues that were concerned the large secular public rather than the theological, doctrinal issues, if you will, that concern the historic appeal of churches of Christ, the more they eliminated the need for any in-house bishop at all. And we'll talk about that in a second. By the mid-70s, the message of the Herald of Truth had become almost indistinguishable from messages being presented by a variety of conservative and or evangelical radio and television ministries. In other words, we fit in with everybody else, the message that was being said. Now, some may look at that as bad, others look at that as good, but nonetheless, that was kind of what was happening. And so the question is that if everybody is sounding alike, why do we need anybody to look to? In other words, instead of saying, what does the gospel advocate say? What does the Firm Foundation say? What did Rule Lemon say? Which is often it was, what did Foye Wallace say? You know, as people look to people to give voice to what they're thinking or what they agreed with, well, that kind of diminished its way out because everything was kind of the same. And by then, many among our fellowships ministers looked more to these evangelical ministries and to the Herald of Truth for intellectual and spiritual direction. It can be said that the electronic bishops sowed the seed of their own destruction. By the 1980s, they were gone. Few looked to the Herald of Truth to provide theological leadership, and the print media bishops had long since passed from power. Little wonder that our churches of Christ found ourselves in theological disarray from what had been. Now, some would say that was a good thing. Some would say it was a bad thing, depending on what position one looks at it from. And so this was what was happening. And so many here lived this, but were you aware of it? Some maybe, some not. Again, rarely are we aware. We realize things are happening, but we don't know how to process that or organize that or put it in ways that make sense until usually kind of later. And so, so what are we doing? We're looking back almost 50 years. So this is 50 years ago. And so quite a ways from where we are now. From all of this, the anti-institutional people gave little evidence of having recognized that the issue of modernization and institutionalization had taken a critical new turn with the emergence of the Herald of Truth. They typically combated the Herald of Truth by focusing on the shop-worn issue of the sponsoring congregation. To all appearances, they remained oblivious to the symbolic power wielded by the national television program and its electronic bishops. In other words, the anti-institutional congregations, those that didn't support this, that said no to these kind of things and so on that we've talked about, they didn't really realize all that was going on with this and kept focusing on the reasons why they said we shouldn't do it. Okay, and yet there was broader things going on also. The Herald of Truth triumphed by rejecting the arguments of the anti-institutional people and amassing power despite their objections, and the proceeding to define new issues that rendered the perspective of the antis completely irrelevant in the life of the mainstream church. Now, a few weeks ago, we were talking, and some people said, I never even heard the name anti. Well, what was anti? Well, that was the congregations that seemed to be against everything as the mainstream defined it. And so, you're against supporting the universities as far as congregation. You're against this, that, and so on, and that's who the antis were. And so, as we said, the mainstream kind of just said, you know what, we're done with you. You want to keep arguing and fighting all that, we don't want to deal with it. And so, basically, that's kind of what happened over time. The de facto exclusion of the anti-movement accomplished by the Herald of Truth proved far more effective than the quarantine imposed by B.C. Goodpasture in 1952. Remember, he was the editor of the Gospel Advocate. Simply because the symbolic power of the electronic bishops far transcended the power of the traditional editor. And so what's going on here? Well, think about when we were dealing with our kids. I remember Donita saying, ignore them. Why do you ignore them? Because it just empowers them on, when they're acting bad or whatever, right? And so we all reckon, well, that's a little bit what's happening here with that. And so it kind of made it, for many, irrelevant. And so they were moving on and not letting those things bother them. Now, in the early 20s, Churches of Christ were just beginning our long, turbulent, if you will, transition from what we viewed as this exclusive kind of group to what our author has called a denomination. Now remember, by denomination, he's saying has become comfortable with the culture and kind of acceptance with that. That's not an institutional structure. Okay? So important for us to remember that. Behind them were the first 100 years when they stood against the values of the world, celebrated poverty and social marginality, and for those who descended from the Stone Lipscomb tradition, anticipated the coming kingdom of God. Before them lay a glorious future marked by striking numerical growth, upward and social economic mobility, and increased participation in American life. And so what happened as we got into the 20th century, we weren't some backwoods, frontier group anymore, but was getting involved with things. Now remember, when the disciples and the Churches of Christ split, the disciples were basically the end that had the money, that were more in the north, that took over the buildings, and all this kind of stuff. And so Churches of Christ generally were, back in the woods, in the storefront, kind of more poverty when that happened, because they took most of the finances somehow of however that works. And so what's happening now in the 20th century is there is this regaining of that acceptance and place and so on and so forth among the others. And so nothing symbolized this transition more effectively than houses of worship, our buildings, that were erected in the 20th century. Many Churches of Christ lost their property, as we said, with the division with the disciples. And for several decades after the turn of the century, as we said, many congregations worshiped in storefronts, tents, small dilapidated structures in poor and out-of-the-way neighborhoods. And so by the 1920s, Churches of Christ began rebuilding. And again, when we're talking about this is happening in the cities, at least first. And then usually those things happen there, and then further out, lag behind, if you will, in that. It's never all at once. And so by the 20s, they began rebuilding, and construction accelerated at a stunning pace by the 1950s. And that decade when the fight over institutions had reached its peak. Okay, so we got this stuff questioning the schools And why were the schools rising and needed support? Well, after World War II, you got everybody coming home. You got the world, hey, we're done fighting. We need to, we're wanting to learn, wanting to grow. We got the GI Bill. Hey, I want to go to my church school. And again, it wasn't just church schools. It was all schools everywhere, of every flavor and everything else. And so, hey, we need money to build these facilities. That was all behind this, as we remember. And so in this, we see this happening in the structures that we meet in. The new houses of worship were significant in several respects. Often elaborate and sometimes ostentatious, they frequently served a highly symbolic function, proclaiming to the surrounding community that it should no longer view the Church of Christ as a tiny offbeat sect from the wrong side of town. In other words, those are those backwoods frontier folk, they're, so to speak. The structures also served a pragmatic function, providing facilities for an increasingly institutionalized religious organization. The houses of worship the Churches of Christ constructed in the 50s symbolize everything the anti-institutional tradition rejected, even though a lot of those congregations eventually did the same thing. And of course, as we've seen this, usually the things that are opposed become kind of accepted later in whatever it is. So I just found these pictures, try to give us an idea. So here you see a old clapboard building. Now, really interesting, you notice there's two doors. A couple years ago when I was visiting Levada Jones, and I was working on this 2 years ago, believe it or not, and I'm talking about her upbringing, and it was in Arkansas, and she was telling me about this concept that, and maybe some of you are aware of it, it was totally alien to me, was the men went in one door and the women went in the other. Did anybody in here ever experience that? Okay, you did. Okay, Bill. And so, and the women sat basically, I think, also on one side and the men on the other. And what was the reason for that, Gerald? Do you know? Don't know, but that was the way it was done, right? And there was probably some taking of Scripture to give some theological justification to it. And maybe theological is too strong a word. More traditional and theological, but a lot of times we kind of equate and mix those up as to them being the same. But anyhow, so you see this, and then things kind of went along, and we still see these today in smaller places generally. So now we've gone to brick. That's, hey, we're coming along. We're moving along. We got better materials now, and of course, often these structures were built by the members, right? In other words, our starting in Ralph and Irene Blake's house up north of town, this congregation back in the early 60s. Was, I think, added on to also somewhere along the line. And so you see his progress. And to where in some places, this is in Ohio, wow, that's a big change from the clapboard buildings. And you know that there were those that threw a fit about it. Now, early, way back in this class, when we were in the 19th century, and some of the places in Ohio, like the Central Congregation in Cincinnati, and of course that was kind of in the north, and the economics after the Civil War were much greater than in the South, at least for quite a while. And so they did that. And if you remember, Benjamin Franklin, who we talked about rather, he was complaining because the Central Congregation had even put in air conditioning, which I guess had just been invented or was new. And he was just writing up all the things about this, and we kind of covered that. So we can see that for some that would do that, and they go, wait a minute, that looks like what the Methodists got, or what the Baptists got. I was at the conference I was at. I was in a Baptist church built in 1912 in Oklahoma City, and it was a big old thing. It was really interesting. But anyhow, so we see this is happening, and so for some that was and for others like yes, Gerald. Well, they probably shared those things quite a bit. And then, of course, we've mentioned the Union Avenue Church in Memphis. And so, wow, that looks pretty Greek. Well, why'd you do that? Well, because Greek showed status. Greek showed learning. That's why universities, at least in this country, we see the pillars and the columns and all that. Why is that? Because it gives the idea of knowledge, sophistication, and so on and so forth. And a permanence and so on and so forth to that. And so we see this, and so you can see what a shock this kind of approach was for some in our fellowship. Now, we had, I just bring this up as an example. When we redid the parking lot, okay, and that was not inexpensive, just a few years ago. Well, there was some that said, what are you doing? They said, I'd come to church on a gravel lot. And okay, but you can't do that here in O'Fallon. And what would people in O'Fallon think if you had just a gravel lot? Well, some would be okay, but most were like, wait a minute, what? And so you have to kind of adapt if you're going to connect to people with certain expectations in certain places. And so in a sense, that's a little bit what this is. And so not only did they build these structures, they moved it from out here, and they moved it onto Union Avenue where all the other groups had their buildings. And so now you're among the accepted. If you ever watched the movie with Debbie Reynolds, The Unsinkable Molly Brown, you ever see that? And of course, what's happened? They're kind of hayseeds from the backcountry, and now they move to Denver among the rich and elite, and they aren't accepted, right? Because all the social class and that kind of stuff, even though they got the house. Well, part of this was you had to have a house among the accepted. And, of course, in that movie, she kind of outdoes them and meets the crown heads of Europe and brings them home and, blows away the snooty people that were there in Denver. But anyhow, but that's some of that thinking that's going on, if you will, that acceptance. And this is Memorial Road, where I attended last Sunday in Edmond. So, wow, what a change. And so some might look at this as this big, magnificent structure, and in ways it is, but it's all a matter of degree. This isn't the clapboard building, wherever, but it's not Memorial Road. Of course, they got 2,000 people there, and a budget of $109,000 a week. Oh yeah, it's like whoa. And I go, last time it was only $75,000 a week. So it's like, wow. Anyhow. So just very interesting. So early as the 1920s, a few progressive, and remember, what is progressive is a subjective term. It can mean whatever one defines it as. But basically those that were doing it differently than the way most everybody did it. A few progressive preachers committed their congregations to taking their place in upscale Southern life. John Allen Hudson, who moved from Oklahoma City to Memphis in 1922 to work at the Harbor Avenue Church in that city. In December of 1925, Hudson submitted an article to the Gospel Advocate describing his role in the construction of a new and elaborate building for the congregation on Union Avenue. And from then on, it would be known as the Union Avenue Church of Christ. Its location was significant, for Union Avenue even then symbolized status and financial respectability. So it's getting into that. Whereas at one time, who cares? That's what's happening. And I'm not commenting on that's good or bad. I'm just saying it happened. When Hudson first arrived in Memphis, he found a small group of Christians meeting in a ramshackle old building poorly located on a 50-foot lot in the middle of a block and rotting down over our heads. In other words, the structure was not doing well. And Hudson determined to replace that building with a commodious house of worship adequate to every need. To that end, he regularly visited all the members of the congregation and systematically and indefatigably agitated the building of a new church home in every home he entered. In other words, he really worked at it and provided that idea and that thinking and the why. Once completed, the building and grounds were worth $125,000. Hey, what happened to my picture? Thank you. Though he claims the finances were in good condition. Now, Hudson hoped this successful venture of growth and construction might serve as an example to inspire others. And of course, some like, wow, what does that show? Success, permanence, all the wow. Hey, we want to go to see those people because they're doing something right, so to speak. Whether that should be the motivation or not doesn't matter. That's often what happens. Now we look at that $125,000. Right? I mean, in comparison, that would have to be millions, not a million, millions. And I don't know how to convert that, but you can see just a huge difference in that. But might as well be $1 billion as far as $100,000 for most people back then. And so anyhow, so we see this happening. James A. Allen, a descendant of the old school, if you will, in Churches of Christ, and editor of the Advocate, at the time was not impressed. So everybody has a view, right? Placing Hudson's work in the category of fads and fancies suggested by professional promoters. And so we get all those unseemly descriptions and label on them on somebody we don't like or what they're doing. Allen declared that a meeting house that has $125,000 tied up in it is a satire on the spirit and genesis of Christianity. After all, Jesus was born in a stable. He selected to be his apostles men who were penniless. In the age when the church grew most rapidly, most of its members were common laboring people, and while some few of its members were men of wealth, they were taught to preserve their wealth by giving it away. In other words, this challenged everything as he understood those assumptions of whatever as could be. And, that's understandable. And yet others are thinking differently. And what's really challenging in our fellowship is that when we had these things, there had to be somebody's right and somebody's wrong instead of that's just they're thinking this way and they're thinking this way. And that's not necessarily against something. But anyhow, Christian meeting houses, Allen argued, should be free from all the luxury of this vain and sinful world. Okay, some of the things that Lipscomb and Harding promoted and are not incorrect. He disputed Hudson's claim that the finances of the congregation were in good condition, stating that the ghost of a frightful $65,000 debt is hanging like a pall over these Memphis brethren. In other words, that's a lot. And of course, if we looked at it today, we would say, wow, I wish that was what was owed. You know, he concluded that God has put his stamp of disapproval upon centralization of wealth and power and on the monopolies of every kind upon big businesses and churches. And so, you know, he's just expressing his assumptions and understandings as applied to this. Allen's voice was crying in a rapidly receding wilderness. By the late 40s, the once apocalyptic Stone Campbell tradition had produced a generation that clamored for upscale institutional structures that Allen had found so objectionable. A notable case in point was M. Norval Young, who we've looked at, who helped to bring about modernization, thought the 20th century Christian, remember he started it in the basement of the Hill whatever church down there in Nashville, who helped to bring about modernization, thought that through the 20th century Christian who helped to popularize G.C. Brewer's Broadway plan of missions and coordinated by a sponsoring church. In other words, Norval Young, who had started that and was promoting Brewer's idea that, wait, we can support these missions and things by the cooperating church, and coming up with those ideas, he was going to very much embrace this. In the late 40s, Young had contributed again to the process of modernization among churches of Christ when he embarked on a systematic effort to encourage construction of modern and strategically located houses of worship. Young was convinced that churches of Christ would benefit significantly from the post-war religious revival, and he was right. And so we will continue next week with Rule on this. And so I hope we're finding this kind of interesting, this process, because some have kind of experienced and lived through this, whether aware of it or not. And I think hopefully if we think back, we can kind of remember some of these things. I don't think I showed it in there, or maybe I will, but you know, the structure of the churches, it was probably came from some kit, you know, where you had the laminated arches, and like over at Overland and Maryland Heights and things. And well, that had to be some standardized, you know, kit or prefab kind of a thing that the churches could do to build buildings. Obviously it's more modest, because you see that all over, and it wasn't just our fellowship. And so that happened a lot in the 50s and the 60s, and probably even the 70s. You saw a lot of that. But anyhow, we will continue next week. Thank you very much. Lemons by 1954. Okay. I think that was probably very popular.